Right, rolling. We are rolling. Welcome back, one and all. Welcome back to the Hoplite channel. I am your host, Hop. And if you clicked on this video, you clicked on to see Norse literature, the Prose Edda, part 1. So we left off the Norse literature series with the Hávamál. And I mentioned at the conclusion of the Hávamál, we would move to the Prose Edda, and then we'd move to the saga of King Hrolf-Kraki, and then the saga of the Volsungs. So for everybody who's returned after watching the Hávamál, welcome back. If it's your first time, welcome to the Hoplite channel. Hope you enjoyed the Prose Edda series in Norse literature. And yeah, let's kick this off without further ado. The passages for this are going to be a bit longer than maybe what you're used to. They're in several paragraph forms. We're moving away from the gnomic poetry that is short and brief that we found in the Hávamál, and moving into more of the detailed myths of Norse literature, Norse mythology. But anyway, let's get some background first, shall we? We know that the Prose Edda is also known as the Younger Edda, or Snorri's Edda, and that it was compiled and written around 1220 AD. Who was the author? Well, Snorri's Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson. Yeah, his name was Snorri, so sounds like one of the seven dwarves, but he was a real guy. And we know that he was born in 1179 AD in Dalasísla, Iceland. That's obviously no longer called that anymore. And he died in 1241 in Reykjavik, Iceland. So, born and raised on Iceland. And we know him to be Icelandic scholar, historian, and law speaker. So this was, in the Old Norse tradition, akin to a judge, someone who would handle civil affairs among people, and he was looked to for that role. Okay, now I could go into Sturluson's background, but that would take some time. Interesting fellow. You should read up on him if you're interested. Yeah, very interesting dude. So because of him, though, we have the Edda, which is the most comprehensive collection of Norse myths and stories. So without Snorri, without the Snorri dwarf, we would not have this intricate and detailed understanding of the Norse myths as they were passed down from generation to generation in the Norse culture, predominantly by word of mouth and storytelling. He actually was the one who decided to write these things down and to commit them to record. So we can thank him for that. But we know that the Edda itself, possibly it's tough to say. I found at least 3 or 4 different versions as to why the Prose Edda, or even the Poetic Edda, is called the Edda. There's no real consensus on why it is such. But we do know that in the Norse language, Edda was a version of the word for a great-grandparent. So perhaps Sturluson, having heard these stories from his grandfather or great-grandfather, if his great-grandfather was alive during his day and age, maybe it's because of his learning of these myths and then choosing to write them down, because he understood the passage of time, these could possibly be forgotten. The Edda, the great-grandfather, told these stories, and now he was telling them to us. So that's possible explanation. Again, I tried to find anything conclusive as to why it's called the Edda, and I came up with zilch. Anyway, that's the one I liked the most, was that Edda meant great-grandfather, great-grandparent, and perhaps the storytelling tradition of the Norse was how the Prose Edda became a written record. Anyhow, we know that it is divided into 3 different books, and that these books predate the Codex Regius by about 50 years. And as I mentioned in the Hávamál part, the Codex Regius was this large volume of Norse literature works, mostly gnomic poetry, and one of those works was, in fact, the Hávamál. So we know that the Edda predates that book by about 50 years, give or take. And the books are divided into these 3 categories. And I worked really hard to pronounce these, so hopefully I don't screw it up right here. Number 1 is the Gilfy, which was the creation and destruction myths. So Genesis and Revelation sort of pushed into one book. The Skjaldskaparmál, And those are just various myths and works of poetry that make up the vibrant and interesting tapestry that is Norse mythology, which we'll go over in part 2 for the Edda. And then the Hatital, which are basically Snorri's own compositions. So he gave us the creation and destruction myths and the poetry and the underlying myths of Norse mythology. But then he worked his little own kind of signature move at the end there with his compositions, and he added that as well. So whatever, he's the author, so it's his work. But the main themes we see from the Prose Edda are the deities of the gods, the lesser beings of the giants, and then there's the obviously the domain of man, and then of course the stories of heaven and hell. And these motifs you can see appear in many different literary genres, fantasy, but also in many different cultural mythologies and stories. The gods are in this Norse world divided into 2 categories: the Aesir that we'll see here in the readings, and the Vanir. And then the giants, the Jotuns, who lived in Jotunheim. These were akin to the Greek Titans. Similarly, the Aesir and the Vanir were the Greek gods that lived on Olympus, except in the Norse world, the gods lived in separate worlds, whereas the gods in Greek mythology all more or less lived on Olympus. And then mankind is mankind, that's the same no matter where. And then you have the concepts of heaven and hell being different realms. And we'll see here that the Norse idea of hell was much different than perhaps the Christian idea of hell as predominantly a evil place. But how even the Greek myth of Hades being a person, a god, and a place to go to Hades, and for the god himself, Hades, to be the keeper and the master of that domain, the god of hell. Hades, it was up to interpretation as a place of torment and evil, or just perhaps a place that you went to after you died, and that was just where you went. But yeah, the Greek myths of Hades and the Norse myths of hell being, Niflheim and Muspelheim, different places, different topography, different weather, but heaven being Valhalla, and then I think there's a heaven for the Vanir as well. But anyway, if you were a Viking, you wanted to go to Valhalla. That was where the slain heroes went to live forever and drink and fight and make merry, and that was the rest of your eternity. Whereas the Christian heaven was just bliss. It was never-ending peace, harmony, happiness, and good feelings, and no pain, no war, no sickness, no death, none of that. But anyway, let's get to Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, and I have a copy right here. Again, it's not very long. I want to say it's less than 130 pages, but it's a great source material if you just want to get yourself familiar with the Norse myths and learn about the gods, the giants, how mankind fit in, and how the Norse world was constructed. But as I said, we'll begin with Gilfy, and these are the Norse myths of creation and impending doom and destruction, which will be the end of the world at the final battle of Ragnarok. Okay, I will provide a read-along as I go. And before I do, I'm going to make this a tradition, I think, and pour myself another beverage with my drinking horn. Yes, indeed. This thing only holds like 10 ounces and half of it's foam. Anyway, skål. Cheers. All right. Let us open to page 10. And this is under the title, Gilfy Encounters the Three Chieftains of the Aesir. And he begins. King Gilfy was a wise man skilled in magic. He was amazed that the Aesir knew so much that everything went according to their wishes. He wondered whether this was because of their own nature or whether it came from the divine power of the gods they worshipped. He set out on a secret trip to Asgard and changed into the likeness of an old man to disguise himself. But the Aesir, because they had the gift of prophecy, were the wiser in such matters. Before his arrival they foresaw his coming, and in preparation for him they conjured up visual illusions. When he entered the fortress he saw a hall. It was so high that he could scarcely see over it, and golden shields covered its roof like shingles. As Theodulf of Finn says, Valhalla, hall of the slain, was roofed with shields. On their backs they let shine hall shingles of Svafnir, when bombarded with stones, those resourceful men. Gilfy saw a man in the doorway of the hall. He was juggling short swords and had 7 in the air at once. The man spoke first, asking the visitor's name. Gilfy named himself Gangleri, saying that he had traveled over trackless paths. He asked for a night's lodging and inquired who owned the hall. The man answered that it belonged to their king. I can take you to see him, then you can ask him his name yourself. The man then turned and went ahead into the hall. Gilfy followed him, and immediately the door closed after him. He saw many living areas there and groups of people. Some were playing games, some were drinking, and some had weapons and were fighting. He looked around, and it seemed to him that much of what he was seeing was incredible. Then he said, all doorways before entering gaze into carefully. One never knows where on the benches enemies are sitting. He saw 3 thrones, each one higher than the other. 3 men sat there, one in each seat. He asked the name of their ruler. The man guiding him replied that the king was in the lowest of the high seats. He was called High. Next came the one called Just as High, while the one highest up was called Third. Then High asked the new arrival if there was some more pressing cause of his visit, although he was welcome to food and drink, as were all in the hall of the High One. Gilfy replied that he wanted to know first whether there was a wise man in the hall. High said that Gilfy would not escape unharmed unless he grew wiser, adding, stand forward while you inquire. The one who recounts shall sit. Okay. So what's going on here in this passage? I got to refresh. This king named Gilfy, right? And supposedly he has these magical powers that he can disguise himself as an old man, and somehow made his way all the way from the realm of man to Asgard. So he made his way from Midgard to Asgard, and he wanted to inquire with the gods how they came to be, who they were, where their powers were derived from, and more knowledge about what the world was and how mankind had its place in it. Disguising himself as an old man and traveling and changing his name, he tried to deceive the gods and trick them. It sounds like something almost akin to what Zeus would do. You know, if you're familiar with the Greek myths, when Zeus would disguise himself as a traveler or as a lowly mortal and walk amongst his creation, Earth, and the mortals, and see how they took him and behaved. But it's also something that you'll see Odin does as well too. He disguises himself as that old man, right? The one-eyed traveler. But as we see here, he goes to Valhalla, and he goes to the Hall of the Slain, which is this massive structure, this mead hall that is shingled with golden shields. And he meets someone outside juggling 7 swords. And the man leads him through, and as he enters Valhalla, it's as though he's entering heaven. He sees these amazing things, people fighting, drinking, playing games, all these activities going on, and such things that just boggle his mind. But when he's presented to the 3, there's the High, the Just as High, and the Third, he speaks to the 3 wanting to know about the beginnings of the world and the Aesir. And these 3 are Odin himself. All right, so spoiler alert there, sorry about that. The 3 are Odin. He is one and the same. He is 1, 2, and 3. But it's interesting that there are 3, right? And there are 3 seated by each other. So if you're familiar with a Christian dogma and religious teaching, there's the Holy Trinity. There's God the Father, God the Son, and there's the Holy Spirit. And Jesus Christ, the Son, sits at the right hand of the Father. Here too we see Odin sitting at the right and left hand of himself. So he is all 3 encompassing one deity, one king of the gods, one ruler of them all, such as Zeus was. So again, as I said in part 1, perhaps Snorri Sturluson around 1220 AD was attempting to use the myths of his people and the common cultural basis that those myths had for people in Iceland and Scandinavia and the Norse, and perhaps sprinkle some Christianity in there just to ease them into monotheism. You can see that this is possibly one of those passages where that occurs, because now you have three different gods, allegedly, but as we know later that they are just Odin himself, but in three different parts, such as a trinity. Okay, let's move on. We go to page 11, section called the All-Father. Gangleri began to question, who is the highest or the oldest of all the gods? Hai replied, he is called All-Father in our language, but in Asgard the Old he has 12 names. One is All-Father, a second is Haran, or Herjan, meaning Lord. A third is Nikar, or Nikar, meaning thruster. A fourth is Nikus, or Nikud, meaning thruster. A fifth is Fjolnir, meaning wise one. A sixth, Oski, fulfiller of desire. A seventh, Omi, resounding one. An eighth, Biflidi, or Bliflindi, meaning spear shaker. A ninth, Svidar, or a tenth, Svidriri. An 11th, Vidrir, ruler of weather. And a 12th, Yog, or Yalk, meaning gelding. Then Gangleri asked, where is this god? What is he capable of doing, and what outstanding deeds has he done? Hai replied, he lives through all ages and governs all things in his realm. He decides all matters, great or small. Then just as Hai said, he made heaven, earth, and the skies, and everything in them. Then the third said, most important, he created man, and gave him a living spirit that will never die, even if the body rots to dust or burns to ashes. All men who are righteous shall live and be with him in that place called Gimel or Vingolf. But evil men go to hell, and from there into Niflhell, or the dark hell, which is below in the ninth world. Gangleri then asks, what did he do before heaven and earth were created? Hai answered, back then he was with the frost giants. All right. So now this is interesting because we have Gangleri, keeping up this charade that he's this, old man traveler, and he's speaking to Odin 1, 2, and 3, and then Odin replies to Gangleri's question, or rather Gilfy's question, speaking about himself. Well, he's the All-Father, and he has several names, and I'll reel them off to you. And he goes through the spiel, but he also says that the All-Father is the Father of everything, the heaven, the sky, the earth, and more importantly, he is the creator of mankind. And through him, mankind shall never die, though their bones turn to dust or their flesh be burnt. The righteous man shall live with him forever, but the wicked man shall go to hell. And worse yet, he shall go to Niflhell, which is the dark hell. This is where the suffering of eternity begins. Again, I think Sturluson here is trying to weave the religion of Christianity into the Norse myths, and to use Odin as a facsimile for God the Father, saying that through all eternity, God was there. God created everything, but most importantly was his creation of man, which happens to be you. Imagine that. And that if you lived a righteous life, he would see to it that you would never die, that you would live with him in his golden hall of Valhalla, just as God would have you live among the angels and saints in heaven. But if you were a wicked man, prone to evil deeds, well then your punishment would be hell. And in this regard, Sturluson is mentioning Niflhell, which was not just hell as in a place that just, is one of the 9 worlds, but the dark hell, where torment and pain and suffering continued on forever. Okay, let's continue. This is the chapter entitled Niflheim and Muspelheim. Gangleri asked, what was the beginning, or how did things start? What was there before? Hai answered, as it says in Sibyl's prophecy, early of ages, when nothing was, there was neither sand nor sea, nor cold waves. The earth was not found, nor the sky above. Ginnungagap was there, but grass nowhere. Next, just as Hai said, Niflheim, or the dark world, was made many ages before the earth was created, and at its center is the spring called Bergelmere, or Roaring Kettle. From there flow those rivers called Svol, Guntra, Fjorm, Fimbulful, Slid, Hrid, Slig, Yilk, Vid, and Leipter. Also there is Gjol, which lies next to Helgrund, or the gates of hell. Then third said, first, however, there was that world in the southern region which is called Muspel. It is bright and hot. That region flames and burns and is impassable for foreigners and those who cannot claim it as their native land. Surt, the Black One, is the name of he who waits there at the land's edge to defend it. He has a flaming sword, and when the end of the world comes, he will set off to battle and defeat all the gods, burning the whole world with fire. So it is said in the Sibyl prophecy. Surt comes from the south with the fiery destruction of branches. The sun shines from the sword of the gods of the slain. Stone cliffs tumble and troll witches stumble. Men tread the road to hell as the sky splits apart. Whoa. That is scary stuff. So what's going on is Odin, as the High or the second or the third, is describing to King Gilfy that before all things were created, there were the two hells. There was Niflhell and there was Muspelheim. And Muspelheim is this region of fire and ash and brimstone. And that is the understanding of the understanding of hell in the Christian tradition. Niflhell is actually it's a similar version of Muspelheim, but the opposite. So instead of constant fire, brimstone, and ash, and lava spewing forth, and just heat everywhere, you have cold and stillness. It is a land of just bone-chilling, biting frost. And this actually, in the Norse world, was a worse version of hell. Muspelheim, where Surt lives, or Surtur, the Black One, you could almost take him as the bringer of destruction in Ragnarok, of almost like the war of the gods, bringing down the world as this giant Surt brings his fiery sword and cleaves the world in half and destroys the gods. He is this embodiment of perhaps the devil or Satan to bring about this destruction. Although he doesn't succeed ultimately because the world begins anew after Ragnarok, but we'll save that myth for a different day. Muspelheim, being this region of the hot fire and brimstone hell, is easily recognizable to the Christian. Niflheim, which is this barren wasteland of wind-driven snow and ice where nothing grows, and the coldness will just cut right through you for eternity. This was the understanding of true hell, because it was just a area of void, of banishment, that if you were an unrighteous or cowardly person that lived a life of wickedness and vice, you would go to hell. But Niflhell, this barren wasteland of cold and ice, was where you would wander aimlessly in the frozen snow. And to the Norse, someone who was familiar with what that cold winter weather felt like, to be doomed to that never-ending winter, that perpetual frost, was probably the scariest form of hell they could think of, because many of them knew what it was like to go hungry in the cold and what the cold could do to you in short order if you did not have heat, warmth, and food. Okay, we'll move on. Oh, and I forgot to mention here, he mentions these rivers that lead to the gate of hell. You could almost say that this is perhaps a nod to the Greek myth of the river Styx, separating the land of the living from the land of the dead, if you like. All right, we'll move to the next section, and this is entitled Ginnungagap and the Emergence of Ymir. Gangleri asked, how were things set up before the different families came into being and mankind increased? Hai replied, when those rivers, which are called Elvagar storm waves, came so far from their source, the poisonous flow hardened like a slag of cinders running from a furnace and became ice. When this ice began to solidify and no longer ran, poisonous drops spewed out and froze into icy rime, or hoarfrost. Then layer by layer the ice grew within Ginnungagap. Then just as Hai said, That part of Ginnungagap which reached into the northern regions became filled with thick ice and rime. Inside the gap there was mist and wind-whipped rain. But the southern part of Ginnungagap grew light because of sparks and glowing embers flowing from Muspelheim. Then the third spoke. Just as coldness and all things grim came from Niflheim, the regions bordering on Muspel were warm and bright, and Ginnungagap was as mild as a windless sky. It thawed and dripped, and to the point where the icy rime and the warm winds met. There was a quickening in these flowing drops, and life sprang up, taking its force from the power that sent the heat. The likeness of a man appeared, and he was named Ymir. The frost giants called him Bergelmere, and from him come the clans of the frost giants. As it says in the shorter civil prophecy, all the seeresses are from Vidlof, all the wizards from Vilmide, but the sorcerers are from Svarthovdi, and all the giants come from Ymir. Here is the giant Vafthrundir says, from the Bergelmere first came the wise giant among sons of giants. When poison from Elivagar splashed from out the drops, it grew until forming a giant. From there all our clans have come, therefore they are also cruel. Then Gangleri asked, how did the families grow from that point? Or how did it come about the others came into being? And do you believe that the one whom you were just talking about is a god? Hai answered, in no way do we accept him as a god. He was evil, as are all his descendants. We call them frost giants. It is said that as he slept, he took to sweating. Then from under his left arm grew a male and a female, while one of his legs got a son with the other. From here came the clans that are called the frost giants. The old frost giant, him we call Ymir. Okay. So what's going on here? These names are, there's a little hard to pronounce, so I kind of stumbled there, but nevertheless, I sallied forth. He's explaining, I'm going to say Odin, he's explaining where the world began. And as he says, these regions of Muspelheim and Niflheim, Niflhell, where the cold and the warm met, the place in between was lukewarm. It was cool and mild. And this was the place where life sprang forth, right? It wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold, it was just right. And from this area, the first being was actually a frost giant, Ymir. And he arose in this area called Ginnungagap. And from him, from his body, sprang the other frost giants. So, as I said in the beginning, you have the gods and the giants, just as you had in Greek mythology, the gods, the Olympians, and the Titans. The frost giants are considered evil by the gods. So even Odin here is saying that Ymir, the first being, existed before the gods. He's saying Ymir, a frost giant, sprang forth from Ginnungagap, and then he gave birth to other giants from his body. But these are evil people, Odin says. Evil people. These are evil beings. The idea is that he's setting the stage for how the gods came to replace the giants, just as how the Greek Olympian gods came to replace the Titans. And we'll see how that happened in a minute. We'll move forward. This is under chapter 6, the primeval cow Humla, Ymir and the birth of Odin. Gangleri asked, where did Ymir live, and what did he live on? Next it happened that as the icy rime dripped, the cow called Humla was formed. 4 rivers of milk ran from her udders, and she nourished Ymir. Then Gangleri asked, on what did the cow feed? Hai replied, she licked the blocks of ice, which were salty, and she licked these stones of icy rime the first day. The hair of a man appeared in the blocks toward the evening. On the second day came the man's head, and on the third day the whole man. He was called Buri, and he was beautiful, big and strong. He had a son called Bor, who took as his wife the woman called Besla. She was the daughter of Bolthorn, the giant, and they had 3 sons. One was called Odin, another Vili, and the third Ve. It is my belief that this Odin and his brothers are the rulers of heaven and earth. We know that this is his name, and it is what we call the one whom we know to be the greatest and most renowned, and you too can easily call him that. All right. Again, that's Odin talking to this guy as though he's speaking in third person. He's like, yeah, we know this guy to be Odin. He's actually pretty cool. We think he's the best. You should worship him like we do. That's good for you to do. Right. So it's kind of funny reading this as God telling this story to a man and maintaining, an unbiased or objective opinion. But what he's saying is there's this cow, it licks this ice, some guy comes out, he gives birth to a bunch of people, and one of them happens to be Odin. But the idea here is that if all that exists are the frost giants and Odin's born of this, this lineage, isn't he kind of the son of frost giants? And his father being among this race of frost giants, does that kind of put him at odds with what he believes? Just the same as Zeus killing or imprisoning his father Kronos, the Titans were the second in command of the world after Uranus and Gaia. And Kronos being imprisoned by his son Zeus, is this the same animosity between father and son that runs concurrently through these different cultures and myths? That Zeus, being the Olympian king of the gods, imprisons his Titan father Kronos, and now we find that Odin believes the frost giants are evil, but he is descended from frost giants, but is himself a god, an Aesir. Let's continue. Next chapter is Bergelmere and the appearance of the second race of frost giants. Then Gangleri asked, how did they get on together? Who among them was the most powerful? The sons of Bor killed the giant Ymir, answered Hai. When he fell, so much blood gushed from his wounds that with it they drowned all the race of the frost giants except for the one who escaped with his household. The giants called that one Bergelmere. He, together with his wife, climbed up to his wooden box, and there they kept themselves safe. From them come the races of the frost giants, as is said here. Countless winters before the earth was created, back then Bergelmere was born. That is the first I remember, when the wise giant was placed on the box. Okay, so what happens here? Well, the sons of Bor, Odin and his relatives, they just killed Ymir. Why? We don't know. They just did. And so much blood came forth from Ymir's body as the first being that it flooded the world. And it flooded the world so much so that it killed all the other frost giants except one guy and his wife. And I don't know if that's supposed to be a allusion to the Noah's Ark story in the Bible. I don't know if that's what Sturluson was doing here, that the one frost giant who made it out with his wife got on top of a wooden box and was, able to keep himself from drowning in Ymir's blood. And this great flood, killing off everything except those two frost giants. Was that supposed to be Sturluson's, Noah's Ark myth? I don't know. You could say it's possible, but it's a little more violent than that God sent the flood and flood the earth with water. Here, Odin and his brothers ganged up on this guy Ymir. We don't know why. Slashed him to bits so bad that he flooded the earth with his blood. And now the race of frost giants can trace their lineage back to the one frost giant and his wife who escaped the flood of blood. Okay, let's continue on. This is chapter 8. The world is created from Ymir's body. Gangleri answered, what did Bor's sons do next, if you believe they are gods? Hai said, it is no small matter to be told. They took Ymir and they moved him into the middle of Ginnungagap and made from him the world. From his blood they made the sea and the lakes. The earth was fashioned from the flesh, and the mountain cliffs from the bones. They made stones and gravel from the teeth, and molars and those bones that were broken. Then just as Hai said, with the blood that gushed freely from the wounds they made the sea, and by fashioning that sea around they belted and fastened the earth. Most men would think it impossible to cross over this water. Then third added, they also took his skull and made it the sky. They raised it over the earth, and under each of the four corners they placed a dwarf. These are called east, west, north, and south. Then they took the embers and sparks shooting out from Muspelheim and flying randomly. These they placed in the middle of the Ginnung sky, both above and below, to light up heaven and earth. They fixed places for all these burning elements. Some were placed up in the heavens, whereas for others which had moved about under the heavens, they found places and established their courses. It is said in the old sources that from then on times of day were differentiated and the courses of years was set. So it is said in Sibyl's prophecy. Sun did not know where she had her home. Moon did not know what strength he had. The stars did not know where their places were. This was before the earth was created, third ad. Then Glengarry said, I hear of great happenings. It was wondrous work and skillfully done. But how is the earth set in order? The High answered, it is circular around the edge, and surrounding it lies in the deep. On these ocean coasts the sons of Bor gave land to the clans of the giants to live on. But further inland they built a fortress wall around the world to protect against hostility of the giants. As material for the wall, they used the eyelashes of the giant Ymir and called this stronghold Midgard, or Middle Earth. They took his brain, threw it up into the air, and from it they made the clouds. As is said here, from Ymir's flesh was the earth created, from the bloody sweat the sea, cliffs from the bones, trees from the hair, and from the head the heavens. And from his eyelashes the gentle gods made Midgard for the sons of men, and from his brains all the oppressive clouds were formed. All right. So, that's a very Viking way to start the world, right? It wasn't just like, there was a Garden of Eden, and there was a guy, and there was a girl. He had a fig leaf on, and she had a fig leaf on. They had 2 kids. One kid murdered the other kid. Then they had to move out of Eden, and then they had to start their life outside the garden. That was the beginning of the world. Okay, that's the Christian story. The Norse story is a bunch of guys' sons got together and murdered the first being that ever existed and literally diced up his body and made the world with it. They took his skull and made the heavens. They threw up his brains, and those are the clouds. They took his bones and his molars and made rocks and cliffs. His blood is the ocean. And his eyelashes they used to make a gate around the world of man. So they literally took this guy's body and decorated the world with it. Okay, yeah, kind of brutal. Not probably something you want to tell your kids as, where everything comes from, like, in their first, early years. Kind of want to save this myth for maybe when they're like, in grade school or high school even. But yeah, that was the world of the Norse. And Ymir, the first giant, the first being, was killed and chopped up by Odin and his brothers, and that's where the world comes from. All right, let's learn more about where men come from. This is chapter 9, and this is the last section. And it says, the chapter, Men are created and Asgard is built. The All-Father sees everything. Then Gangleri said, it seems to me that they have accomplished great things when the earth and sky were made. The sun and the moon set in their places, and the days divided. But the people who inhabit the world, where did they come from? The High answered, the sons of Bor were once walking along the seashore and found 2 trees. They lifted the logs and from them created people. The first son gave them breath and life, the second intelligence and movement, the third form, speech, hearing, and sight. Bor's sons gave them clothing and names. The man was called Ask, or ash tree, and the woman Embla, or elm tree. From them mankind came, and they were given a home behind Midgard's wall. High said, next they made a stronghold for themselves in the middle of the world, and it was called Asgard. We call it Troy. There the gods lived together with their kinsmen, and as a result many events and happenings took place, both on the earth and in the sky. One place there is called Hlidskjalf, or watchtower. When Odin sat in his high seat, he could see through all the world and into all men's doings. Moreover, he understood everything he saw. His wife was called Frigg, Fjorgen's daughter, and from this family have come the kindred we call the family of Aesir. They lived in old Asgard and the realms that belong to it. Each member of this family is divine. For these reasons, he can be referred to as All-Father, since he is the father of all the gods and men and of everything that has been accomplished by his power. Earth was his daughter and his wife. With her, he and his first son, and this is Asathor, or Thor. He has strength and might, and because of this, he defeats all living creatures. Okay. So this last section here, he asks, where do men come from? You made this place called Midgard. So he relates that the 2 trees that the gods take from the earth, the ash tree and the elm tree, ash being the man, elm being the woman, and joins them together. And from these trees sprout mankind. and that Midgard was designed to be their realm. Why the gods built them Midgard and why they felt it necessary, who knows. But they also build themselves Asgard, which is in actually the middle. And Asgard is the realm of the Aesir, the Mount Olympus, and just like Zeus sits on his throne in Olympus, so too does Odin sit in his watchtower, and he has this, not like a crystal ball, but almost like a interdimensional window into all of the realms of Norse mythology, all of the 9 worlds, and he can see what is going on in each, and he can intervene if he likes, just as Zeus would. This is different from the heaven and the God, monotheistic God in Christianity, whereas God is disinclined to take personal action and intervene into the realm of men. This is called the use of free will as the will of God, versus Zeus and perhaps Odin oftentimes getting into mischief and trouble or intervening on behalf of individuals in the real world because that just is their way. That was perhaps a difference between the Christian God and the Greek and the Norse God, the All-Father. Anyway, so that is the beginning of the Prose Edda. Those are the creation and the foretelling of the destruction myth at Ragnarok and the end of the world. It's an interesting, it's an interesting set of stories there. It's kind of funny hearing it told by the god Odin himself to this king Gilfy, and the relation of the story of where all things came from and how all things are destined to be. Anyway, I know this one probably went on pretty long. Hopefully you're all still awake. I enjoyed reading this stuff. I read this book probably almost 10 years ago now. But it's interesting to reread these myths and to refresh my memory as to the Norse mythology of creation and of destruction, and to juxtapose them against the other religions and mythologies of the world, in particular Greece and Christianity. Anyway, we'll pick up with the Prose Edda Part 2 next time around, and then we'll get into more of the myths and the poetry of Norse mythology beyond just creation and destruction and where all things come from. These ones will be cool. These will, as they mentioned, we'll get into some of the myths of Thor and Loki, Odin himself, of course, Balder, Tyr, all the other gods. So anyway, if you're liking this stuff, give it a thumbs up. If you like the channel, please subscribe and share it with family or friends if you think they would enjoy Norse mythology or hearing about the Edda. In any event, we'll see you back for part 2 of the Edda. And till then, as always, take care.